I picked some oranges. I don't know if they're totally ripe, but I feel like something has shifted. Like it's now the days where I usually start going downhill a bit, but I'm feeling good. I'm feeling like I'm not sure. And my friend and I were driving back from the beach. Went to the beach today. And there was a Chevy Volt in front of us. And I thought to myself, I wonder if I would ever drive one of those or buy one of those, or what are the benefits of those cars. And then I talked to my friend, my brain twin, and he was saying that he could lend me a car for a while. And lo and behold, it's a Chevy Volt. So that was kind of weird randomness, because I talked to him earlier today, and then he said, can I call you back in 10 minutes? And then he didn't call me back. Then I went to the beach. Then I came back from the beach. And then I saw the Chevy Volt. And then he told me about the Chevy Volt. So it's an interesting sequence of events. And I'm feeling like I want to use my remaining time in California to get into shape, because I've gained a few pounds since I got here. And my belly is kind of big. So I'm going to try to do the walking on the rope thing. I have a new goal to try to master this thing. So far, it's not so good. It's kind of hard. I can do about 1.5 steps. It's kind of fun though to work on a new skill. If I go back home and I can walk across this, I may have accomplished something. For now, I've done my practice for the day. So by tomorrow, I might have a vehicle to use. I might be able to make the most of my time here. Maybe I'll treat the remaining 2 months or so more like a vacation and treat myself more. And I am feeling better. And I haven't started to have those sort of downhill days. I'm going to call Hardy Nutritionals on Monday, which is in 2 days, and check in with them. And they'll probably tell me to just keep going at the same dose. And I might do a few days on oranges only, because California has lots of oranges. and I slept in today until like 10. One thing I'm doing is always sleeping a lot if I have the chance. So sleep, hearty nutritionals. Maybe I'll start to eat just a little healthier and get a little bit more physically active with that balance string, and I kind of want to learn to do a handstand, but I think I need to lose a couple pounds before learning, because that body weight will be more ideal for trying to stand on my hands. And lately, I've been feeling kind of excited about the prospect of going home and being off my meds and being just in a lot better shape and better place than I was when I got here, because it was a bit dicey before I came here, and then it got dicier, and it seems I'm slowly working my way out of that. And I'm grateful for the fresh air. I'm grateful for the silence. I'm grateful for the sound of all the birds, and I'm noticing the beauty and the movement of life again. So I think my body's happy with the drugs coming out of my system. I want to go home. I would love to get an infrared sauna at some point to help pull all of the drugs out of my system. So just a bit more of a check-in. I'm definitely feeling more energy, and I think that it could be a sign of getting over some kind of hump in the process. Maybe because I've had more days in a row that have been good than usual. So that's a good sign, and I'm feeling energetic. Like I want to do things and learn, and so that's good. was reading a little bit of David Bohm's book, Wholeness and the Implicate Order, and there was just some part of it that I want to read to myself. On page 53, he's giving an example of a radio and how if it feeds back upon itself, it just creates a bunch of noise. But if it tunes in with the radio wave, which is something outside of itself, then it produces the sound that is beyond its own structure. It's beyond just the radio and the antenna, but it's a product of tuning into the wave. And then he says, one might then suggest that in intelligent perception, the brain and nervous system respond directly to an order in the universal and unknown flux that cannot be reduced to anything that could be defined in terms of knowable structures. And to me, that's the realm of map. We're tuning in to something else. And he says, intelligence and material process have thus a single origin, which is ultimately the unknown totality of universal flux. In a certain sense, this implies that what have been commonly called mind and matter are abstractions from the universal flux, that both are to be regarded as different and relatively autonomous orders within the one whole movement. It is thought responding to intelligent perception which is capable of bringing about an overall harmony or fitting between mind and matter. Because just before that he said, what then is the relationship of intelligence to thought? Briefly, one can say that when thought functions on its own, it is mechanical and not intelligent, because it imposes its own generally irrelevant and unsuitable order drawn from memory. Thought is, however, capable of responding, not only from memory, but also from the unconditioned perception of intelligence that can see in each case whether or not a particular line of thought is relevant and fitting. And if I think about that really deeply, that's a lot to do with what I'm talking about with this map domain. And on page 56, he says, what is required here then is not an explanation that would give us some knowledge of the relationship of thought and thing, or of thought and reality as a whole. Rather, what is needed is an act of understanding in which we see the totality as an actual process that, when carried out properly, tends to bring about a harmonious and orderly overall action, incorporating both thought and what is thought about, and in a single movement, in which analysis into separate parts, e.g. thought and thing, has no meaning. And I was thinking about how I was talking to myself recently about how would we live if we weren't just sitting there explaining things to each other, but if we acted as if we understood. And to me, that's what happens when we're in so-called mania, when we're in map consciousness, at least for part of the time. We're acting with understanding. We're not explaining our actions and we're not explaining our perceptions, but we're acting with understanding. It's only later, when we're misunderstood, that we have to do all this explaining. I feel there's something way beyond even this trying to explain things to each other, trying to explain things to people who don't understand. There's the living of it, because explaining things is already too late. It's already happened, it's already passed. But if we can even drop the need to explain and just live in that and act with understanding within ourselves, and that is related to how I talk about when you're really clear with perception, you can understand something. You don't even have to do all this research or this or that. You just look at it and you understand. So when he says, rather what is needed is an act of understanding, and I feel like in that state, we see the totality as an actual process and that we're an integral part of that process. No explanation needed. And when we're really in harmony with that, we're riding that wave of perception and understanding without having to retrospect, without having to think about and explain. So I thought those were two cool bits that I wanted to read to myself. And I have a few points that I'll talk about to round out the video. I made a note that thought is partly what destroys the brain and causes it to break down because of its repetitious and mechanical nature. And I was thinking about this in terms of what Patricia Louise wrote about how the neurons are overfiring in the prefrontal cortex and the neurons break down. They pretty much fray at the ends. And so in that way, we're thinking a lot in that state, and there's a lot of different thoughts. It's like thought on overdrive, and it's destroying the nerves. And in that way, thought actually breaks down thought. So what can destroy thought but thought? So by the brain activating this hyperthinking process, it's kind of breaking down the structures of thought in the brain. So I feel like the more thoughts in bipolar are actually to break down the machinery of thought, which seems to be what's happening in the neurons at the neuron level. It's sort of like if you want to break a machine, you overrun the machine, you wear it out. Otherwise, how would that really get broken up? Because if we're always in so-called normal thought consciousness, that's not going to break up, and we feel like, oh, well, everything's fine. But overall, things aren't fine at the level of humanity with regards to thought. And it's related to that thing I read by David Bohm, how thought operating on its own, just from memory, is machine-like, and it's not really correlated to reality. So it's not harmonious. And so then tons of thoughts would definitely not be harmonious, and it just breaks down the machine. So it could actually be part of the intelligence of the process. It's like the brain trying to destroy that part of the brain, because the brain sees that it is not needed to that same extent that it was before. And it's part of the whole thing that there's always chaos before there is any kind of new structure or evolution. And regarding the brain sending myelin to the prefrontal cortex and how I was talking about, it's kind of like the equivalent of inflammation. And this inflammation is caused by thought. So overthinking and too many thoughts. And it's not that a me is thinking these thoughts, it's just happening. And so that overthinking in so-called mania and psychosis actually causes this brain breakdown and causes the inflammation in the brain. It's like the wrong energy going through the brain. So it's like thought and the me and society is actually what causes the brain to break down, because it's the energy of all that. So thought, me, and society, thought, the me, and society causes brain inflammation, and it causes it to break down. And I feel like the brain is kind of like how cholesterol shows up in arteries when there's plaque formation, and it's not necessarily high cholesterol that causes hardening of the arteries, but cholesterol shows up in a way to kind of protect the arteries, just like the myelin shows up to protect the brain. But unless the underlying cause is addressed, and I feel like in the brain it's the wrong energy, it's the energy of thought and the me. Unless that is addressed, then the problem is going to continue. And it's interesting that she said that these WMHs also are in the hippocampus. And I think that was to do with the myelin going there too. And apparently the hippocampus is where new neurons are birthed. So it's interesting that that happens in the process, and it could be that new neurons are being birthed at a faster rate. So I see this again as a sign that it could be brain metamorphosis. And she also talked about how the pineal gland absorbs light and helps to regulate sleep and wake with melatonin or serotonin secretion. And I'm pretty sure those substances are converted into DMT, which is dimethyltryptamine, which is the bliss hormone or something. But I was thinking that the pineal gland might have something to do with the stuff I talked about before, of how when the light of perception hits our clear mind screen, then we produce the correct response. And interestingly enough, she talked about how the pineal gland hardens because of fluoride, and a lot of water sources are fluoridated. And to me, it's a way to keep our perception narrow. It's to calcify our pineal gland so we can't really see, so our vision isn't clear. So it's interesting how she mentioned it. And I feel like if it's not clear, we can't turn light into meaning. So I feel like fluoride is anti-meaning. And I heard once that I think it's is based on fluoride. So it's definitely a dulling substance. And I was thinking about some of the traits we gain through map consciousness, and they're actually brain traits. So one of them is making meaning, dialogue, perception in the moment, and action. And unless we continue to use these faculties, we lose them. That saying, use it or lose it, I think it applies to these new traits as well. And that's why I talk about harvest, practice, and body. And I feel like if we lose it and our brain goes back to sort of how it was, yet there's some kind of energy that wants to come in and break it up, so our brain operates in new ways. By going back to the old ways, that's actually inviting the process to start up again. Whereas if we're able to stay with some of these traits, then maybe it will allow the energy to come in gently instead of really forcefully. And I listened to a video by Andrew Saul, and he has some really good information on health and mental health as well, in terms of vitamins and megadoses. And he mentioned taking tryptophan from cashews, or just taking it, as well as taking lots of vitamin C and also niacin. And I'm taking Hearty Nutritionals right now, so I won't introduce those other things. But I'm pretty sure with Hearty Nutritionals you can take extra vitamins, but it's not good to take extra minerals because it's in a certain balance. Don't quote me on that, but I'm just saying that to remind myself at some point to maybe start taking some more vitamin C. And I am eating a lot of oranges, so that could be good for vitamin C. And one important point he made was that some people are nutrient deficient, but other people are nutrient dependent. So dependency would mean having to take it all the time. So maybe there is a mutation in one of our genetic pathways where we can't make certain nutrients, so we have to take it in excess and maybe larger amounts than other people would. And so I feel like if this Hearty Nutritional thing works, I'll be on it indefinitely. And they said as much. They said it's not a cure. And in that way, it makes me feel like a person is pretty much dependent on these nutrients to stay sane. And I think that's a fair deal. I wrote down something about words of reason and how it was related to seeing things for oneself as opposed to maybe having a faith-based perceptions. And in a way, it was a logic of the self, seeing for oneself and then accumulating facts and knowledge around being able to understand or reason something or learn. And by accumulating, we actually created this separate self, and we collected facts. And that was logical for the time being. But now we're seeing something else. We're not seeing for oneself as in the ego me. We're seeing for Gaia. We're seeing beyond ourselves because there's a selective pressure for us to do so in terms of the totality of the planet. So perception selects for traits. Perception creates genes. And that is based on Dr. Bruce Lipton's work. So I feel like by perceiving beyond ourselves, we're starting to create the right genetics in the brain to be able to continue to do so in order to be able to continue the species of human being. So the self was okay before, but now we have 9 billion selves, and it's just not sustainable to see that way. Doesn't mean it's not sustainable to keep growing at this rate. That might not necessarily be true. We might be able to continue to grow as a population at the same rate, but we can't continue to see the same way and grow at that rate. So the environment, the energy of the environment, what's happening in the totality of the cosmos is like a computer. It can compute exactly what's going on everywhere at once or in just one point. Each point is like a computation that implies every other point. So it knows what we're doing. It knows what's happening. And then that energy creates the environment, and the environment creates the pressure on us to see what's really happening and not just see what's happening for ourself. And so Gaia is creating a selective pressure for the brain to mutate. And I listened to a talk by somebody who was talking about evolutionary biology, and they were talking about how nature and evolution and animals and things, they mutate at the last second. Nothing happens in advance. We don't change in advance of the necessity of the change. So I think this relates to what I've talked about with how something will shift really quickly, and then the brains that are adapted for this new way of seeing will actually be the ones that survive. So the point was that evolution never does anything in advance. And I wrote down that there's something that sees and creates the mutation. And I think I've talked about this before, how however much we're consciously perceiving, there's still the subconscious calculation that's going on all the time. So even if we're ignoring things, we're still picking up on it to a certain extent. And there's something that sees, and that's a subconscious thing, and that's also collective. So we're all walking around picking up all this different information in our perceptual field, and the bit that we pay attention to is related to the me, but something else is seeing the rest. There's something else that we all share, and it's calculating, and in that way it will know exactly what to do and how to change things when it's necessary. And so it's life as a whole that sees the need. So when a bird gets a longer beak to adapt to the conditions of what bug it needs to eat in the bark of a tree, it's not that the actual bird, the personal bird, sees that it needs to mutate. It's actually the whole energy of that species and Gaia that sees that it needs to change the bird in order for the bird to survive, and probably does so at the last second to save that particular species. And it's not that ones don't die out, they do for sure, but so there's something that sees the bird is dying off because its beak is not long enough. Through the bird's eyes, of course, and and it filters into the collective calculation of everything. So it's life itself. Life itself is part of the design and the designer and the designed. There's no separation. So it's not even that the me sees that the brain needs to mutate. It's something else that sees that. So yeah, that's it for today. I will check in tomorrow to see if I'm still feeling good. And of course, I need to be aware of feeling too good. So I will talk to Hardy Nutritionals about that on Monday and ask about being careful of that too.